Okay, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Leo Hickman. I'm the editor of Carbon Brief, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, which is focused on the very hot topic of loss and damage. As hopefully you will have seen throughout this week, we've been publishing a range of articles about the topic of loss and damage on our website. And our series concluded today with this webinar, which features 4 experts who can further explain the subject to us, and in particular maybe kind of get into the topic of why this is going to be a huge talking point at COP27, the big UN annual climate talks, which will take place in Egypt in a little over a month. I'll just quickly explain the format of the webinar that we're going to have today. So we've got about an hour, roughly. And we will begin by hearing from our experts in turn. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Daisy Dunne, Carbon Brief's special correspondent, and also Josh Gabbatiss, our policy correspondent. If you can wave, you can probably see Daisy and Josh on the screens. And they're going to moderate the session going forward and get a bit more into this topic, obviously, with our special guests. And then also, finally, we will obviously have time to put some of your own questions to the panelists. So please use the chat. I think we're all very familiar with Zoom nowadays, but please use the chat box down below. The Q&A box, I think it's actually called, down below at the bottom of your screen to type in the questions you want Daisy or Josh to sort of put to the panelists. So I think what we will do is let's start with, actually because we're still waiting for, I think, one speaker to join us. Harjeet, if it's okay, I might start with you to go with you first. So Harjeet Singh, who's the head of global political strategy at what we know as CAN, the Climate Action Network. Maybe Harjeet, if you can just begin, if I give you the floor, you can set out your own thoughts on this kind of huge topic of loss and damage, and then we'll go in turn to the other speakers. Thanks, Harjeet.
Sure. Thank you so much, Leo, and the entire Carbon Brief team for your work on the issue of loss and damage. The explainers that you have put out, these are fantastic, and really something that is very much needed for the world to understand why the issue is so important. And yeah, thank you for also setting up this webinar where we can talk about those issues and tell why this issue is so important. To just set a context, from Climate Action Network's perspective, this is the litmus test for the success of COP27. We said the same thing for COP26, and we were able to escalate it to a level where it cannot be ignored politically anymore. And we have seen how policymakers this year assembled, like a couple of weeks ago in Cairo, just to discuss loss and damage, all heads of delegations to talk about that issue. So this is how important it has become. But let's go back to what has happened over the last few years and why COP27 is extremely important. When we talk about the issue of loss and damage, we have seen negotiators treating it as a side issue. Whereas, when you talk about people who are facing climate impacts now, it speaks to the very purpose of UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as Paris Agreement. Why do these conventions and agreements exist? These conventions and agreements are not about installing solar panels and wind turbines. It's about protecting people and the planet. And the issue of loss and damage, which means the adverse impacts that people are facing right now, or what we call climate emergency, is a report card of 30 years of inaction. We knew 50 years ago that climate change is going to cause havoc. We knew what the cause is, and we knew what we needed to be done to avert the crisis, but look at where we have landed. So I would say that the whole convention was about preventing the loss and damage that we are facing right now. And we have failed in the last 30 years to do that. So now looking at loss and damage as a side issue is not acceptable, because this is the reality that millions are facing right now. Every single day, we are seeing devastating disasters hitting the world. You know, right now there's a storm in the US. We have seen Pakistan floods. We see droughts in Africa. We see wildfires all over the world. That's the reality. And what story it tells? It's a story of injustice and violation of human rights caused by just a handful of countries and corporations, their greed and their apathy. So on one hand, as we speak, fossil fuel companies are making windfall, obscene profits, and people are suffering, and we don't even have resources to help those people recover from these impacts so that they can rebuild their homes, they can, rebuild their lives and start all over again. And we are struggling to get, and this system of UNFCCC has not even delivered a single penny to help people like in Pakistan suffering from these impacts. So this COP27 is the most important COP, because the kind of political mobilization we have been able to do, we now have to make sure it delivers. It delivers climate justice that we have been demanding by creating a new system of funding so that we can support people who are facing climate emergency now. So that's in a nutshell what the issue is and what we are trying to demand. Of course, technically, we call it a loss and damage finance facility. And that's where the discussion should be, how we can get it so that people who need to get support, they get it through the UN system and not relying on the humanitarian system alone, which is insufficient and not based on obligations. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Harjeet. I've just seen that Ineza Grace has joined us as well, which is fantastic. Maybe we can come to you next, if that's okay. So Ineza is the director of Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, and perhaps you can just set out your own kind of, I guess, understanding and interpretation of what this term loss and damage means, just as a kind of setting the scene for us all as we start this webinar. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation to attend. First, I have to apologize for the background noise. I just had the internet issue at my the office, and now I have to move to the nearest cafe. But I was really happy that I'm able to join. So for us, by us I mean youth. Today, youth, for us, loss and damage is pictured as the injustice that we are living, because we are the generation that is going to be living we are living in the era where extreme weather event is at the extent that have never been recorded before, and yet we are not fully included in taking action to address this impact, which means we are going to be left out with a planet that is more at risk in a way that we are not able to have a future. So, for example, when we look on how this impact is affecting us, so for us, loss and damage or climate change negative impact is affecting, first of all, our economic development for our country, because most of the youth, especially from the global south, we are not able to see a future, because once a disaster hits, like flooding, erosion, or cyclone or typhoon, it washes away all the economic development that our country has been struggling to get. And when that disaster happens, there's no international process that is going to listen to the cry or to the disaster call of a country that is asking to be able to be resilient in this era. And in addition to that, also we are also seeing that the world leaders taking action in climate action, they've been entertaining the fact that we can have more time to discuss, have more time to analyze which are going to be the best instruments to resolve today's crisis. And that for us is not the right approach we should take. We need action now. We need the ability to respect and to understand the community that are facing this damage, because at the end of the day, we are all vulnerable, but those who are much vulnerable are the ones who did less. So as part of the Loss and Damage Coalition, our metrics is not different from what Harjeet said. For COP27 to be a success is to see an establishment of a loss and damage finance. So whether you call it a funding arrangement or a facility, whichever name you can give it, what we want to see is to go out of the COP27 with with the concrete and tangible new finance available and accessible to address the climate change impact from the grassroots perspective. And in addition, we also want to see the global process understanding and honoring the right of the grassroots community who've been dealing with this impact of loss and damage for a longer time. So they have the skills. They're the one who should be the leaders of informing the world how to be better prepared. So for if I can take example, the flooding that happened in Belgium last year and the same event happening in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh was able to save a community, but in Germany, a lot of people were lost. So which means different countries should need to stop and listen to the Global South approach and request of having concrete action addressing loss and damage if we want to move forward in a global solidarity. So that will be what I would say for now. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ineza. And next up, we're going to hear from Inès Bakhtaoui, who's a research associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute in Oxford. So over to you, Inès.
Thank you, Leo, and thank you for the invitation to talk about this issue, which is more than an important issue. It's a matter of death or life for millions of people across the globe, but especially located in the Global South, as Harjeet has so rightly indicated. At the Stockholm Environment Institute, we work on the topic of loss and damage under the prism of finance and how to operationalize it. And as you know, Professor Saleemul Huq was supposed to join us, and I hope he will, because he is the expert on the matter, and he has been on the forefront of moving this issue on the global agenda and to bring a local approach, especially from his perspective of Bangladesh, to the issue of loss and damage. Loss and damage has been an issue in the UNFCCC since its beginning. The Alliance of Small Island States have brought up the need to anticipate slow onset events as a form of rising sea since the writing of the convention since 1991. And for years, for decades, it's been put aside by developed nations as a non-issue and then a side issue. And thanks to the amazing push by negotiators, by governments that are at the forefront of those climate threats, and the efforts by the global community of researchers as well, and activists, it is becoming the crucial issue at COP27, I think, because now is the opportunity to rediscuss elements of finance, such as the global goal, the global finance goal. We're talking about implementation through the Santiago network, which we might get back to later. But most importantly, loss and damage is the illustration of the failure of global North countries to mitigate their emissions and to do what's necessary to provide funding for global South populations to adapt. And so we're at SEI, we're now thinking of how to make the finance, how to bring the finance to the right canals and reach the right people in time, in an appropriate way, which centers their needs, their priorities, and does not hinder their capacity to develop, to rebound from the effects of climate change, and to thrive in a respectful way.
Okay, many thanks, Inez. I think we're obviously waiting for Professor Huq to join us, but I think obviously there's a connection issue, etc. So we'll obviously, as soon as he arrives, we can bring him into the discussion. But I think at this stage, what I'll do is I'll hand over to Daisy and Josh, and the reason for that really is they've both been absolutely immersed and buried in this topic over recent months, putting together and marshalling and kind of overseeing our special week of content that we've been publishing this week. So, and they will both be at COP27 full carbon brief reporting on it, and where, as we've already heard, loss and damage is going to be a huge issue. So Daisy and Josh, I'll hand over to you to carry on this session.
Thanks, Leo, and thanks so much everyone for joining us. It's been really interesting to hear your kind of introductory remarks. I have heard from Saleem, and I know he's attempting to join now. He's just having a bit of trouble, so hopefully he'll be joining soon. But what I wanted to do first of all is kind of ask each of you a first question. So we obviously hear a lot about loss and damage, and it's a term that's used a lot at UN climate talks, but could you each kind of describe an example of loss and damage from the region that you live or the region that you work in, something that kind of stands out to you as a visceral example? Maybe I could go to Ineza first, if that's okay. Don't know if you can still hear me, Ineza.
You're muted, in case that helps.
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry.
Yeah, so are you happy to go ahead and describe an example of loss and damage from your region?
Yes, sure. So I can share an example of what happened in my country, based in Rwanda. So in 2020, when the world, we all know we had the COVID, everyone was into lockdown. But in the beginning of the year, in March, April, until May, we were experiencing intensive rainfall that destroyed a lot of house, and then we had our community being forced to move out of their house, despite of the government lockdown restriction. So this is to mean that that for us, most of the time, health issue doesn't matter that much when we are dealing with climate change impact. In the report that was done also last year, we found that we lost 4,000 hectares of land. And these land were agricultural land. And then for us as a country, agriculture is the third main pillar of economic development. So which means when we lose 4,000 of hectare of land, we are losing crops production. And most of the farmers are women, especially in the rural area, and small scale farmers, which means we are pushing more, the community are being pushed more toward food insecurity and not having a stable, sustainable economic development. And that was last year. And even in this year, we are dealing with a lot of erosion, landslide. We have a number of people who are dying. And these deaths are not something that we can protect ourselves from, because it's something that happened overnight. So we're not prepared. But we have some example or efforts that our government is putting forward, because let's face it, once you're a country that is experiencing this negative impact, you have to think on how your country or community is going to be able to prosper. So we have a couple of examples that our country is putting forward that include relocation of a community from flooding prone area to area that is much more safe, because Rwanda is a land of 1,000 hills. But those efforts are minimal, because what we need is it's bigger, if I can say, and there's no such accessibility of where our country can get access, like access of the fund to do all the measurement that they need to address loss and damage, especially the non-economic impact. Because the economic, maybe there are some means, but when you look on non-economic impact of loss and damage, there's no portfolio for currently. So that would be what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Harjeet, can I invite you to speak next? Thanks.
Well, speaking of South Asia, I'm so sure you saw horrific pictures of Pakistan floods, where 1/3 of the country was underwater and 33 million people were displaced. And the cost of damage is being calculated as $10 billion. Imagine just one incident. And this is also an underestimation, because the estimation has just begun. But I must also talk about the heat waves in India, which made headlines a couple of months ago. And the reason I want to bring that into context, because due to heat waves, 60% of the area under wheat production was affected. And let's also remember India, just a few weeks before, when they realized that how heat wave has hit them hard, was actually trying to meet the deficit caused by the Russian war in Ukraine because of disruption in wheat supplies. So here India was stepping up and was doing agreements with countries so that the food crisis can be dealt with. And here it was struck by heat wave and had to abruptly stop exports, could only meet the commitments that they had already made, and had to scale down exports dramatically. So the reason I'm bringing an India example alongside Pakistan, look at the impact that goes beyond national borders. If we think adaptation or loss and damage is just a local issue, we're not understanding the magnitude of impacts that are happening and how our economies are intertwined. We live in one climate system, and we always say when we talk about impacts, we have to talk about how we share, seas and oceans and rivers and mountains, which means our strategies and ability to respond should be brought together. So, and we need to stop looking at these as national and local issues. Impacts that are happening right now go way beyond our own national borders. So, the scale of impacts is now massive. And that's what we need to understand. So it's not just a developing country issue. It's not just a local issue anymore.
Thank you so much. And just step in now just to say thank you, Professor Saleemul Huq, for joining us, and apologies that you had a few difficulties. Just to fill you in, we've just heard some introductory remarks from the other speakers, and we're speaking a bit about loss and damage in the regions that they're living in and they're working in. So I would like to invite you, actually, could you speak a couple of minutes just in terms of loss and damage and its importance to COP27? It'd be brilliant to hear from you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Daisy, and apologies for not being able to join earlier. I was having difficulty finding the link. So let me just give you an update on where I think we stand with respect to the topic of loss and damage. First of all is to say that it's happening. Right now, in fact, in Florida, they have a storm of unprecedented proportions. Several million people are under evacuation orders. We still don't know the magnitude of the damage that's going to be done, but I can tell you it's going to be in the billions of dollars. And so it's happening every single day somewhere in the world, and it will continue to happen every single day from now on. And the Florida storm, Ian, is the biggest they've had so far, but that's not going to be true next year. They're going to have a bigger one next year, and then they're going to have another bigger one, even bigger than that, the year after. So we have now entered the era of impacts from human-induced climate change, causing losses and damages from those human-induced climate changes, and we need to deal with that, and we are not prepared to do it at all. Even the richest country in the world, the US, is not prepared for this. So and it's a collective problem, as Harjeet said. It's a global problem with impacts in one place having repercussions for across the globe, and we haven't seen anything yet, by the way. If we think the Ukraine war was bad and COVID was bad, combine the two and climate's going to be even worse than all of them. So we are still, just at the edges of seeing what is going to happen. In that context, the utility and ability of the UN Framework Convention comes into question, because the vulnerable developing countries have been demanding for some time now that loss and damage be given a prominence in the discussions, which it has not had so far. And in particular, in COP26, the developing countries together collectively demanded the creation of what they call the Glasgow Facility for financing loss and damage. And that was a collective demand from all the developing countries together. That was in the draft text of the Glasgow Pact until the last minute, when we were extended by a day, and we came back and we found a revised text that had converted the Glasgow Facility into the Glasgow Dialogue for Finance for Loss and Damage. And not just dialogue for a year, but dialogue for 3 years. And this was at the insistence of the United States of America, who said they'll talk about it for 3 more years, but they won't do anything. And Mr. John Kerry, the US envoy, has just repeated that mantra just a few days ago in New York. And so we, the developing countries, have proposed, and the UN Secretariat has accepted, and the COP27 presidency has accepted, a provisional agenda item for finance for loss and damage in COP27. Now, provisional means it has to be adopted at the beginning of the COP. And if one country or a number of countries disagree, then it won't get adopted. And so this is now going to be the big fight coming up in Sharm el-Sheikh. I'd ask you to keep your eyes open for that. The vulnerable people, certainly, the vulnerable countries, I'm sure many of them as well, will seek to get this agenda item adopted, but failure to adopt it, if it's blocked by any country or countries, will be seen as a failure of COP27 before it even starts. This is going to be an agenda fight for the agenda for 2 weeks of COP27. And if we lose the agenda fight, we might as well come home and forget about the rest of the COP, because it'll be useless in face of what is happening in the world on climate change. You know, it's beyond mitigation and adaptation now. We need to deal with loss and damage. Is by far the most important issue that needs to be discussed. And if the UNFCCC doesn't do it, then it basically becomes redundant. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Saleem. I mean, so I'm going to direct a question at Inez specifically now. You know, we've heard a lot from the other participants about the enormous costs that are already mounting. I mean, the estimates for future losses and damages are absolutely enormous. And I know that your work has focused on ways to mobilize. I mean, mobilize is a horrible word, but ways to raise the funds basically to pay for these things. So I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about some different things that are on the table that might be able to help.
Yes. So I'd start by pointing one thing that, as Professor Huq said just now, loss and damage is already happening. It's a pressing issue. And in the UN, the negotiations have led to a stalemate until now on creating a structure, a facility that could direct finance from loss and damage to developing countries and to global South countries' populations. So there is a need to look at other alternative options in the immediate to address this issue, because what our research has shown is that the current sources of finance to address whether extreme events, disasters, or slow onset events, so sea level rise, desertification, and other mechanisms that happen gradually, they are not appropriate. They are not fit for purpose, and they do not have the right amount of funding necessary to address all the impacts as they happen in the world. I guess the answer to your question I can link to one of the questions that I see in the Q&A chat box, which is about whether loss and damage is always a country level issue, or whether it involves, for example, rich countries could have access to these fundings. The question on whether it's a country level issue, I'd say no, because within the UNFCCC, it's a country-led process. So it would be a country-to-country transaction, but the importance of reaching people is essential, and our work has focused around how to ensure that communities and local level is reached with that level of funding, and that can be reached, for instance, by creating structures that allow local populations to have decision making power in the structures through, for example, devolution mechanisms, or by having them sit at different boards of decision making in funds or in funding structures. So that's on the recipient end. On the contribution, on the contribution to replenishing the funding, there is obviously a country responsibility. So countries are responsible for providing funding, but in climate justice principles, one of the core ones is polluters pay. So it's not just countries, it's also corporations. So we also have to think of ways to make sure that companies, businesses that cause climate change through extraction and of fossil fuels or through the production of releasing of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, also through taxing or through levies, for example, for aviation or other mechanisms, contribute to these types of funding. And then it's about the structure and how to make sure that the channels that are created are structured in a fair way.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. We're going to move on now into the audience Q&A section of this webinar. So I'd invite you again, just any questions you have, if you want to direct them in particular to panelists, please just put them in the Q&A box. And the first question I'm going to ask is one that was actually sent in advance of the webinar via email by Andrea Gross. So Andrea is asking, how do you see the links between adaptation and loss and damage? So maybe I could direct this question first of all at Saleem. Saleem, are you still able to hear me? Maybe Harjeet, if you'd like to take the question of adaptation and loss and damage.
Sure. I should probably go back to 1992 when we all came together as a global community and got this convention. The global community was very confident that we will be able to avert the crisis, and that's how the whole focus was on mitigation. When you read the convention, you find adaptation or the word adapt being referenced 4 to 6 times because there was hope and there were also not many impacts. So everybody was on one side, let's focus on mitigation. But by the time we reached 2001, we realized that we need to work on both mitigation and adaptation alongside. It's not, and also some people or countries thought that talking of adaptation, and Saleem can talk about it more. He's the guru. He's the one who started fighting that fight 30 years ago when nobody even wanted to talk about adaptation. So he has come back. So probably he should tell you that story better. But yeah, I'll just say one line and then let him explain. So adaptation is something that you do before the events hit you. But loss and damage is about the humanitarian impacts that you see. People lose their homes, their crops, they are displaced. That's not adaptation. So let's talk about Pakistan floods. You don't talk to them about retrofitting. Retrofitting of a home is adaptation. They've lost their home, right? You can't say that the crop that you are going to sow, it should be resilient to salinity. They've lost their land. Now it is about loss and damage. Now it's about helping them rebuild their lives. So it's about relief. It's about rehabilitation. It's about reconstruction. So that's the difference. And I'll let Saleem talk about the history of adaptation.
So thank you very much, Harjeet. So basically, when we talk about loss and damage in the UNFCCC context, there are 3 ways in which we have all agreed, this is agreed language, to tackle it. The first one is the word avert. And the word avert we associate with mitigation, reducing emissions that avoid having impacts altogether. If you don't reduce the greenhouse gas, you don't have the temperature rise, you don't have the impacts, you avoid them. The second word we use is minimize. Minimize is really adaptation. You adapt before the impacts are happening and you minimize those impacts. And I would argue, my country, Bangladesh, is very good at adaptation. We are one of the most adapted countries to the impacts of climate change. We have very, very good adaptation. But then the third word is address, when both mitigation and adaptation fail. And we have now entered the era of failure because we have not done enough in the last 30 years. And once the impacts happen, then mitigation, adaptation are now no longer what the people need. The people who have lost everything, as Harjeet says, their homes, their livelihoods, their crops, they need help. And they are not getting that help. They're getting it from the humanitarian sector, but they're not getting it from the climate change arena, because this is human-induced climate change. And if you heard the speeches from the Prime Minister of Pakistan at the UN General Assembly last week, the Climate Minister of Pakistan, Sherry Rahman, even the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres. They're all pointing to this is a man-made, pollution-made impact, and the polluters need to be held responsible, and they need to step up. You know, at this point in time, we're not suing them. We're just telling them, step up, accept responsibility, and do something. And they're refusing to do that.
Thanks again, Saleem. Yeah, so I'm gonna move on to a next question now, which is from Vivek Gupta, who's an independent journalist from India. He's actually sent several questions through, so I'm just going to pick my favorite one, and I'm going to direct it to Ineza. So this is about his question is there a global consensus on what is included in loss and damage? I think this is quite a profound question, because I think from what I can see, the discussion around it, I'd be interested in, Ineza, what you think when you've been to the COPs and you see different countries arguing about loss and damage. Do you think there is a consensus on what loss and damage is, or do you think that's a big part of the problem?
Thank you so much. That's a really good question. So for me, to answer it, I would say that it started when there was denial that loss and damage is happening. It was some country's problem, not the other one country problem, because in my head, I think like they felt like they were protected in order to get those kind of impact be to them. And now it's much more clear that no one is protected. We are all on the same planet, and then we are all going to leave the same impact. But the question is, how do you define this impact? Because from some country, they want to define this impact as maybe another opportunity to make more money, in a sense, or more restriction, or amplify more their power and authorities, in a sense. But the other part of they are having this problem is, or like those damages explained as the mean to a mean for their life. So it is their right. They have the right to a safe future. They have the right to be able to go to school without waking up in the morning and see your school is being destroyed. So it's their rights. And then because historically we know who's the one to blame, in a sense, like who played the big role. And because of the inaction, as said, now the blame is so high that they're not even happy to acknowledge the past mistakes. So for me, what I think needs to happen is that the one side needs to acknowledge the past mistake and then be ready to unlearn everything that they learn how to do in climate action, and learn to do it the best way. And this best way needs to be led by the global south, or the one who are experiencing this impact at a higher extent, because they're the one who are able to come up with concrete solution, a concrete step on how we can resolve this. So I don't know if I respond to your question, but that would be how I can go. Thanks.
No, that was really good. I don't know if anyone else wants to address this. The question of definitions of, obviously we've just had from Harjeet and Saleem have both laid out quite very clear and easy to understand definitions of loss and damage, but I don't know, I feel like when you hear, for example, John Kerry talking about loss and damage, he's coming from quite a different perspective. I don't know if any of you could speak to that.
Let me weigh in on that a little bit and build on what Ineza just said. It's not a technical issue, it's a political issue. You know, as Saleem and I just explained, it's so simple for us. It's so simple. There is, how you define loss and damage when people lose their homes, right? And not when you have time to adapt. The reason rich countries did not allow, because they do clearly see it as an issue of compensation and liability, and it is. It's an issue of compensation, liability, reparation. But we have been negotiating and talking about it in good faith, and that's how the terminology of loss and damage, which I would also argue is depoliticized and calls for international cooperation and solidarity, because we want to have that spirit of cooperation under the UN. So, John Kerry also talking about trillions and also talking about liability. So he knows, and they have been knowing about it for decades, and that's why they did not allow discussion on loss and damage to move forward. And that's why they're deliberately muddying waters and saying, no, it's adaptation, it's not loss and damage, because loss and damage directly relates to compensation and liability, as I just said. So it's a political issue, not a technical one. But only when developed countries face disasters, I can even name the country that had massive floods last year. And when we had a bilateral with them, they said, oh, now we understand what is loss and damage, because last year we had massive floods, and I'm speaking of Germany. Okay. And which is very painful, because we have been facing these disasters for decades, and we have been explaining it to them. But till the point they face these disasters, they did not even want to talk about it, which is very sad, and which also shows how negotiations in this space have been very self-centered. And I must also remind everybody that the original proposal and plan of rich countries was that Paris Agreement should only be about mitigation, not even adaptation. Forget about loss and damage. So that has been the perspective. So again, I repeat, it's not a technical issue to not understand what is adaptation or loss and damage. It's political.
Thank you, Harjeet. So I've got another question here. I think Inez might be the one to tackle this one. So this is from Ricardo Garcia, who's a journalist from Portugal. How does loss and damage fit into the just transition discussion? Should job losses due to climate policies be addressed within loss and damage policies? So I don't know if you could have a go at answering that.
I'd say that everything is linked. Everything is linked in the sense that job losses are a consequence of the poor planning and the lack of anticipation and funding for a just and fair transition that prioritizes humans before profit. Whether that fits within loss and damage, in the context where we talk of losses and damages as the consequences of climate impacts that have not been prevented or that could not be prevented, consequences of mitigation plans, of transition towards a carbon-free economy do not fit within that typology. But both relate to justice issues, to climate justice, and both deserve as much importance to the extent that it's the livelihood and the dignity of people who are at play here.
Thanks, Inez. The next question is from Natalie Shortall. She says that she works in political advocacy, and one of the main barriers to governments agreeing to loss and damage finance facility is a concern that obligations could essentially be limitless. So she says, beyond moral responsibility, which does not always sell with politicians, what do you think is the best strategy to convince politicians that this is an issue they should get behind? Again, I think an a very big question, and kind of gets to the heart of a lot of this debate. I don't know who would be the best to answer this. I think any probably have a go at it.
Let me have a go at it. Let me go at it. So, one of the arguments that we make to the developed countries who are blocking this issue of loss and damage and have made the words liability and compensation taboo, is that if you are afraid of unlimited liability, then you have opened yourself up to unlimited liability by not negotiating a limited liability with us. The UN Framework Convention is there for the polluter and the victim of pollution to agree to a limited sense of liability. And as Harjeet has said, we have agreed. We will not ask for unlimited, but we have to give us something, and they're giving us nothing. And so the UN Framework Convention will become redundant, and we will go to International Court of Justice, which is happening with Vanuatu, and we will ask for unlimited liability then, okay? When we go to other arenas, that's when they have to fear unlimited liability. The opportunity to limit liability is negotiate with us in COP27.
Great. Oh, Harjeet, I can see your hand up. So do you want to add something there?
Well, it's really sad and frustrating that they have been talking about their concerns about unlimited liability and compensation, but they have not gone through the process of introspection and see what have they actually done in the name of climate action. The US, look at their emissions from 1991 to until now, you minus the setback that they got from COVID, emissions went up slightly and are actually at the same level. Look at our dependence on fossil fuels, still 80% as the global economy. We have not solved the problem, we have aggravated the problem. And we are doing that now in the name of energy security, digging and drilling everywhere so that we can live those unsustainable lives. And then we say we still don't want to be held accountable and we don't want polluters to pay. Is that justice? That's the question we need to ask. So on one hand, they want to defend themselves. On the other hand, they want to continue to commit crimes against humanity. These are crimes. We know that by drilling more and digging more fossil fuels, you are committing crimes. But that continues and we don't pay to the climate victims. That's not acceptable.
Ineza, I can see your hand up. Do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add from what Professor Saleemul and Harjeet said, that when it's all going to be resolved if the world, especially global north leaders, start to treat loss and damage as our problem, because currently they approach it as their problem. So they keep seeing as something from afar, which again put on them being able to keep the same lifestyle. That is increasing the impact or the injustice for the other side. So unless they are able to understand that loss and damage is our problem, is the one we have to come a solution, regardless of where you're coming from, because each of us should start. But they're the one who need to take bigger responsibility, because they've been the one who've been refusing to understand for quite some years. So they should step up and acknowledge and then treat loss and damage as our problem, not their problem or someone else's problem. Thanks.
Thank you. So another question now from Mark Galloway. How helpful do you feel that media coverage has been in raising awareness of this issue? How could the media do a better job? Ineza, I don't know if you want to start by addressing this, and then we could move on to the other panelists.
Yes, sure. So I'll answer the one using the example of what we do in LDYC. So we have one working group, the storytelling working group. And the purpose is to be a platform where we are able to share the lived experience from both the global north and the global south perspective on loss and damage. And all of our stories, if I can say, are meant to be a sign of hope. Yes, you can. We are explaining how we are living this injustice, but with the message of hope. So the media, quite sometimes, it is pictured to be a little bit depressive or a little bit discouraging on one side, like saying the bad news all over again. And then we were just trying to make positive media or positive sharing of this story of loss and damage, in a sense that we are able to like call out the global solidarity between among humans, because we are all human, and also have a sense of having something you can contribute, an action you can take. And I feel like the media have been doing a good job, because I'm pretty sure that the coverage that we get in COP26 on loss and damage, the facility or the finance or the negotiation was a little bit need credit for the media, because they're able to listen to the negotiator, listen to the actors, and make the noise. And that's actually what we need, because we need to ensure that whatever is happening in a small room, that's what I call the negotiation room, is a small room, need to be translated in a way that someone who doesn't know what COP is will understand and know exactly that in a space there's someone who's speaking for their distress and they're coming together for a solution. So that would be like a powerful thing that media is doing, and that can encourage it a bit more. But I just also like to add that there's a little bit of a need to cover stories in the Global South perspective, like proper stories. Thanks.
Inez, I can see your hand up there.
Yeah, I would like to add to what Ineza just said, that, well, obviously, because I work on this issue so closely, I might be biased because I am in a bubble and I read issues that primarily talk about this. But in mainstream media in Europe, which is where I live, I see that anytime there is a climate event that happens, like recently in Pakistan, where 1/3 of the country got flooded, I see that it is covered in terms of fatalities, and that very often there is a link made with climate change. But where I think the media currently fails is to link that to the absence of action, of proper mitigation, and of proper reaction of countries to compensate the populations that have been hit. There is a lack of acknowledgement of the responsibility of corporations and of countries, global North countries primarily, in what has happened and what is happening.
Thank you. Harjeet, you have something you wanted to add?
I'll just come in very quickly. First of all, big thank you to media. I mean, the reason we are talking about the issue today and the way it became a political priority is because of the media coverage. So big thank you to everybody who covered and helped us relay our voices. And we all know how important role media plays as an important pillar of democracy and the fight against inequality globally. Yes, there are gaps, as both Inés and Ineza said, particularly in the Global South. One more concrete thing that I would like to suggest, we have to also follow through stories. And when we especially talk about loss and damage, and that's where we also bring in the role of facility, because we tend to forget disasters. How many of us have talked about Hurricane Maria in the last few years that was hit by Hurricane Maria that hit the country of Dominica, and the country lost 226% of GDP, and 81% of loss and damage was unfunded. They had to put in their own resources. What's happening to people there? You know, we talk about issues of displacement. Massive, like 33 million people are displaced in Pakistan. But what's going to happen to them a couple of years later? We know that humanitarian funding is not going to be enough. What about twin cyclones in 2019 in Mozambique, when they had to go for loan? We are not talking about Mozambique anymore. I think we have to keep those issues alive, because people have not recovered from these disasters. The support has not reached them, and which means that now countries and people are stuck in that vicious cycle of debt, which has now become such a big issue. So I think highlighting those stories now, but also following through, is really important for us to tell a story that how important it is to have a mechanism, have a facility that follows through and puts this issue alive.
Thanks, Harjeet. I think, yeah, those answers are all very interesting and really sort of speak to some of the fundamental issues with the media generally and media coverage of climate change. But yeah, thank you for the range of perspectives there. For the next question, we've got an anonymous question, which is, what has been the position of China regarding loss and damage? And this is quite an interesting one, because at the last COP, the G77 plus China, big group of developing countries, got behind a loss and damage finance facility. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear what people's thoughts are on that. What's China's position been over the years? Saleem, maybe you'd be good, well placed to answer this.
So the issue of loss and damage in the UN negotiations has been a very dear subject of the most vulnerable countries. starting with the small island states who were the first to raise this issue, because for quite a few of them, it's an existential threat. The entire countries will go underwater if we don't protect them. But then increasingly other vulnerable country groups have joined forces, and there are 4 of them. There's the Alliance of Small Island States. There's the Least Developed Countries Group, poorest countries, with which I am associated. There is the Africa Group of Negotiators, the whole of Africa. And there is a group of Latin American countries called AILAC, A-I-L-A-C. These 4 groups are regarded as some of the most vulnerable. They're not the only most vulnerable, but they're some of the most vulnerable groups. And the 4 of them together are roughly 100 plus countries, which makes them a majority in the UN Framework Convention, which has 195 countries, and then makes them a supermajority in the group of 77 in China, which has 136 members. Now, these are all small countries. They can't, even within G77 in China, they can't stand up to the likes of China and India, etc. But when they are together, all 101 countries together, as they are on this issue, then the rest of the developing countries come in on their side. And that's what happened in Glasgow. In Glasgow, it was a common position of all the developing countries, including China, G77 and China, to create the Glasgow Facility for Finance for Loss and Damage. Currently, the chair of the G77 in China is Pakistan. So Pakistan put forward that proposition. This was before they had the flood. Now that they've had the flood, they have become the #1 champion of making this an issue, because they're feeling it themselves. And they're speaking not just on their own behalf, but on behalf of all the developing countries. So we hope that that voice will get due recognition in the discussions that we have coming up in COP.
Thank you. So moving on now to another question from Laurie Goring, the journalist. The COP27 presidency says a creative way, an acceptable way to tackle loss and damage is needed at the meeting. What do you think something creative and acceptable would look like? Harjeet, would you like to start on this?
Well, I don't know whether I should call it creative. When people are losing homes, you need a response that can help them recover from those disasters. But we know how these climate negotiations work. Again, we need to look at what we are demanding right now. And we know practically we are not going to see money flowing in billions at the end of COP27. So we have a plan. We as civil society are saying you first agree that we need a finance facility, right? Right now the terminology is financial arrangements, financing arrangements. But essentially you need an institutional structure so that we can have an oversight of all the impacts that are happening, as I was just alluding to, and then support starts going to them. So this year it's about agreement. Next year is about unpacking those operational modalities. And year 3, we should start supporting. And we know that not each and every penny, and I think we have been clarifying that, not each and every penny has to go via this new arrangement. And a lot of coordination is going to happen with the existing system. But the most important function is that coordination, is that oversight, and then of course a provision to have some money to support where the gaps remain. There is going to be research, there's going to be new disasters like slow onset events, sea level rise, glacial melt, and so on. But what we need to agree, and that's where probably the creativity comes in, should we first agree on functions or we agree on a form? We have been demanding that we should agree on a form because we know what functions that form can deliver, which means that facility can deliver. Now, that's where the creativity is going to be. What we land at COP27, that things that a body should do, and then discuss what that body should look like. Or we say we need we did that, and we have all kinds of examples. We agreed on Green Climate Fund first, and then defined what it's going to be. And we took good 18 months to do that. We did the same thing for Santiago Network in 2019. But because that gives a political mandate, I think that's where the space for creativity is. But I think what we are going for is demanding justice and support for people. So negotiators have to put their head together and then deliver on that climate justice. Whether they call it creativity or they call it constructive engagement, I leave it to them.
Thank you, Harji. I'm just going to ask if anyone else wants to come in on that, because I think that's going to have to be our last question. So I'll give you guys. Does anyone else want to? Inez, do you want to give your thoughts?
There are two sides to this quote. There's creative and there's acceptable. When it comes to creative, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel here for loss and damage, including for loss and damage finance. There have been plenty of solutions that have been outlined for years by negotiators from Global South countries, by researchers, by activists, I am working on outlining some of them through interviews and through literature review. Hopefully that will be ready for COP27. And so the solutions are there already, and they've been outlined. And then when it comes to acceptable, my question is acceptable to whom? Is it to the global north or to the global south? Because if we're talking about climate justice, we need to make sure that first it is acceptable for the global south. And for that, there needs to be an agreement on a certain number of principles of boundaries for climate finance, of how it should be mobilized, how it should be processed, how it should be distributed, and how it should be used. And that needs to be aligned with the fact that the priority needs to go to the people who are victims of climate change in the first hand and respond to their needs, their priorities, and their well-being.
Thank you, Inez. I'm afraid we're going to have to end the discussion there. There are a lot more questions. I don't know if, something we've done in the past is with the excess questions, we've put them to some of our attendees, and if they have time, they have sent us over some written answers. But I'm not going to put pressure on people to do that. But that we may be able to help with that. Just thanks everyone for attending. I think you'll all agree we've had an incredible set of speakers. This is only going to grow as an issue in the coming weeks and months. It's going to be major at COP27. I hope that Carbon Briefs series, which we've been working on this week, which we've been working on for months, but we've published this week, provides you all with a good overview. If anyone's new to this topic, it features the voices of most people on this panel, and hopefully it's a big issue. It's a very technical issue. It's a political issue, but it's also obviously deeply important for anyone trying to understand the issue of climate change. So thanks everyone for attending, and yes, we'll see you all soon.